Sir Handel is one of the oldest engines on the island of Sodor. He's a dark blue color and has a big number 3 painted on his side. Sir Handel is also known as one of the smoothest engines on the narrow gauge controller's railway. Sir Handel had been working in the stone quarry all summer. The narrow gauge controller, Mr. Percival, was happy to see him back. Mr. Percival told Sir Handel, whooped Sir Handel, and off he chuffed. At the orchard, Sir Handel was coupled to the trucks. He pulled them away very carefully. He pulled them around the lake, across the stone bridge, and he started to puff up the hill. Then there was trouble. His pistons puffed and traction rods rattled, and his boiler bubbled and bounced. Sir Handel couldn't go on. Peter Sam puffed up behind him. He was worried. He whistled, wheezed Sir Handel sadly. Peter Sam felt sorry for his friend. Puffed Sir Handel, peeped Peter Sam, and he pushed Sir Handel and the freight cars of apples all the way up the hill. When Sir Handel arrived at the station, the narrow gauge controller was very pleased. Said the narrow gauge controller. Said Sir Handel. Sir Handel was happy that the narrow gauge controller was pleased, so he didn't tell the narrow gauge controller about his problem. Said the narrow gauge controller. Puffed Sir Handel, but he was worried. When Sir Handel arrived at the farm, the farmer was waiting. Said the farmer. Chuffed Sir Handel, and he puffed away. But soon Sir Handel came to another hill. His pistons pumped, his traction rods rattled, and his boiler bubbled and bounced. Sir Handel couldn't go on. This time, Duncan puffed up behind him. Sir Handel told him all about his problem. Duncan was happy to help. With Duncan's help, Sir Handel delivered the sheep safely to their new field. When Sir Handel arrived at the transfer yards, the narrow gauge controller and Mrs. Percival were waiting. The narrow gauge controller was very pleased with Sir Handel's work. Now he had a surprise special for him. Said the narrow gauge controller. Puffed Sir Handel, but he knew that the track to Cody Fell was very steep. Sir Handel was more worried than ever. Sir Handel puffed towards Cody Fell. The track was even steeper than he remembered. He chuffed. Then there was trouble. His pistons pumped and his traction rods rattled. Inside the passenger car, the picnic hamper burst open and the narrow gauge controller and Mrs. Percival were juddered and shuddered. Sir Handel shuddered to a stop. The narrow gauge controller was worried for his engine, he said. Sir Handel wished. The narrow gauge controller listened. Sir Handel wished. The narrow gauge controller listened. He said. The narrow gauge controller made a telephone call. He looked very serious. Later, Sir Handel was held back to the transfer yards by Mighty Mac. Sir Handel was very worried. He was sure that the narrow gauge controller was going to send him back to the quarry. Sir Handel arrived at the transfer yards. He saw Thomas. Tooted Thomas. Smiled the narrow gauge controller. Sir Handel smiled from buffer to buffer. He had never felt happier. Sir Handel was soon fixed, and now he could chuff cheerfully up Cody Fell. The children in his passenger cars whooped and cheered. Sir Handel gave the smoothest ride of all.